Welcome back to JavaScript Fundamentals. Today we are going to talk about animations. And you might think, well, why animations after style? Well, one of the keys to unlocking animation is to manipulate style. If you're moving an element across a page, then you are manipulating that element's top and left CSS properties. If you're making an element grow or shrink, then you are manipulating the height and width CSS properties. So if manipulating style is one key to unlocking manipulations, the other key is to perform those manipulations gradually so that there's a delay in between each of those manipulations. Because without a delay, the movement would happen so fast that it would appear instantaneous. So we have to put a delay so that we can see the gradual change from one frame to the other. So it's exactly like animation for a normal cartoon or even for a movie. Movies are broken down into individual frames, and there's so many frames per second in order to make that movement seem natural. Well, we have to do the same thing within our code. And in order to achieve that, we have two functions that allow us to set a delay. One is called set timeout, and the other is called set interval. So we will look at these two functions first, and then we will see how we can use them to create animations. We'll start with the set timeout function. This is a global function, so therefore it is a method of the window object, but we just typically say set timeout. This function executes another function on a delay, and that delay is for whatever amount of time that we want to delay. So let's first write a function so that we can delay the execution of that function. So let's call this do something. We do not want any parameters, and I will show you why here in a moment. And then we just simply want to know when this function executes. So we are going to write something to the console. We'll just say do something executed. So now whenever we call the set timeout function, we want to pass in the function that we want to execute, but we do not execute that function. And that's why I did not want to put parameters here. Because we can't execute this, we need to pass the actual function object. So the do something function object, and then whatever amount of time that we want to delay the execution of do something. This is in milliseconds, so 1000 is 1 second. Let's do 2000, that's 2 seconds, and that's short enough to be able to not be annoying, but also be long enough to see that there is a delay. So let's load this within the browser, and we will see the delay whenever I get the console up. Let me refresh so that you can see that it's going to appear right down here. Whenever I refresh, there's nothing there, and then 2 seconds later, there it is. Do something executed. The set timeout function only delays the execution of the function that we've specified. It doesn't delay the execution of the rest of our code. So let's add a call to alert. Let's just say hello. And so whenever the browser loads this code, it's going to create our function. It's going to execute set timeout and set it on a delay of 2 seconds. And then it's going to execute the alert. And then 2 seconds later, do something is going to execute. So let's go back to the browser. Let's refresh. There's the alert. And then we just need to wait for the console to be written to do something executed. So that's important to remember. We're not delaying all of our code, we're just delaying the function that we have specified. And where this gets interesting is when we call set timeout inside of do something to set a timeout to execute do something again. So we would call set timeout, specify do something, and then we would want to execute that in 2 seconds. Now, since we are using this same value in two places, it does make sense to store that within a variable and use the variable. So I'm going to call this variable speed. I'm going to give it a value of 2000, and then we simply use the speed variable wherever we want to specify the delay for set timeout. So whenever the browser executes this code, it's going to execute line 10. It's going to set a timeout for do something for 2 seconds. Whenever do something executes, it's going to write something to the console, and then it's going to set another timeout for do something for 2 seconds. So we get ourselves into a loop that iterates every 2 seconds. So let's go back to the browser and see this in action. And we will first see the message, do something executed. And then whenever it executes again, we see this little number appear next to our console message. And this is Chrome saving space so that it doesn't flood the console with the same message. It just tells you how many times that message has been written to the console. So right now that's been 10 times, 11, and 12, and so on and so forth. So there's two ways that we can get ourselves out of a set timeout loop, for the lack of a better term. And one way is to use a counter, much like a for loop. So let's create a variable called I, give it a value of 0, and then inside of the do something function, we can iterate or increment I with I equals I plus 1, and then we can use an if statement. If I is less than 10, then we want to call set timeout. Otherwise, we don't want to call set timeout anymore, and that will get us out of this loop. So let's also change the time. Since we are doing it 10 times, that would be a rather lengthy endeavor. So let's do half a second. So whenever we refresh the page, we will see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then it's going to stop. And something that would make this a little bit easier to see would be to say, do something executed I times. And this isn't going to be 100% accurate because we are starting at 0. But we could do something like I plus 1, put parentheses around it, so that whenever this is displayed within the console, it's a little bit more readable for us and whoever else would be reading it. So whenever we execute it, we can see that this is executing for 10 times and then it stops. So that's one way that we can get ourselves out of this type of set timeout loop. Another way is to use another function called clear timeout. The clear timeout method, as its name implies, clears a timeout, but it needs to know what timeout to clear. Well, the set timeout function actually returns a value that is a timeout ID, and then we can use that ID by passing it to clear timeout to clear the timeout. So when the browser executes this code, line 14 is going to execute, it's going to set a timeout for do something, and return that timeout ID to our timer variable. And then immediately after, the clear timeout function is called, passing in that timer variable. So do something is never going to execute, so we're not going to get into that loop whatsoever. So let's go back to the browser, refresh, and we can see that there's nothing happening here. And that's because we cleared the timeout before it had a chance to even execute the function that we set for a timeout. So we could use the set timeout function somewhere within our set timeout loop in order to break us out of that loop. But in this particular case, we don't need to because we've already set up a counter and we have a boundary so that whenever we reach that boundary, we just simply don't call set timeout again, therefore breaking us out of that loop. And this is how we used to do animations. We would set up a set timeout loop and then we would track the progress of that animation. And then whenever we reached a boundary, we would just simply stop the animation by not calling set timeout. But we were wrong to use set timeout in this way because the primary purpose of set timeout is to defer the execution of a function one time. It's not designed to repeatedly call the same function with a set time delay. For that, we actually have another function called set interval. And this is somewhat like set timeout, except we're not deferring the execution. We are setting an interval so that for whatever amount of time we specify, it's going to execute that function. So inside of do something, we don't have to call set interval again. It's just automatically going to do it because that's the nature of set interval. So let's go back to the browser and run this, and we will see that this is going to go past 10 because that's just what it does. So we need to find some way to break this interval. Well, we have a function that is similar to clear timeout, except it's called clear interval. So we would call clear interval, and then we would pass in the timer ID that's created whenever we call set interval. And then we need to change our condition because we want to say if I is greater than 9, then we want to clear the interval. So let's go to the browser. Let's refresh. And this will go until we reach 10. And then it will stop. So this is how we can use the clear interval function to basically stop the interval we created by calling set interval. So we use the set timeout function to defer the execution of a function, and we use the set interval function to repeatedly call a function with a time delay. So let's look at how we can use the set interval function to actually perform animation. I already have the HTML set up. All I need to do is take out the display none. This is going to be a box with a background color of blue. Its height and width are both 100 pixels. It is absolutely positioned, and it has a position top 50 pixels, left 50 pixels. So if we go to the browser, refresh, we will see our box. And let's also get rid of our console because we don't need it. Now we want to animate this box to the right. So we want to manipulate its left style property so that we change it until we reach a particular point. Let's just pick 400. So whenever this gets to a left position of 400, then we want to stop the animation. So let's go back to our script and let's clean this up so that we start completely, well, not completely, but almost from scratch. So we don't need our counter. We don't really need the code to call the set interval. We'll just comment that out. And let's change the function name from do something to something more specific like move box. The first thing we need to get is the element that we want to animate. And that is our div element with an ID of box. So let's go ahead and create a variable, call it L, and document.getElement by ID box. The second thing we need to specify is our counter, but we're not going to use a counter like we did earlier. We are going to keep track of this element's left position because that is what we are going to use to determine when we need to stop the animation. And in order to get that information, we are going to use a property called offset left. The offset left property gets the left position of the element in relation to its nearest position ancestor element. And I know that that kind of sounds like a bunch of gobbledygook, but in layman's terms, at least as far as this element is concerned, we are going to get the left position in relation to the body element. If the div element with an ID of box was actually contained within another element and it was positioned, then it would get the left position in relation to that parent element. So that is what the offset left property does. There's another property called offset top, which gets the same type of information, but it is the top position as opposed to the left position. And let's also create a variable to contain the value that we want to use to move the element by, so that we can easily change that by just changing the value of this particular variable. So now we need to actually perform the animation, and that is done by simply manipulating the element's style. So we are going to do l.style.left, and then we are going to take the current position, so left plus move by, because that is how much we want to move this element by. And then we also need to concatenate that with px, because otherwise we will not move our element at all. So we are taking the current left position, adding the move by variable to it, so that's how much we are going to move the element, and then concatenating px. And then we need to perform our test. So let's do if left is greater than 399, because we want to stop at 400 or around 400. Then we want to clear the timeout, and let's call this timer. So we need to uncomment this line on 16, and we need to change the do something to move box. We have speed already set up. Now this is actually going to be too slow, but we'll go ahead and run this one time so that you can see what it is going to do. So let's refresh. and you can see that it's moving across, but it's doing so rather slow. So we need to speed this up. A good number for animation is 10 milliseconds. So if we go back to the browser, this is still going. If we refresh, and there we go. Well, that's a pretty easy animation, so let's do something a little bit more complicated. Let's say that whenever this box reaches its right side boundary, that it starts animating to the left, and then we can specify a boundary on the left, and whenever it reaches that boundary, it'll start animating to the right. So it's going to bounce in between these two boundaries of whatever we specify on the left. We started off at 50 pixels, so let's just set that boundary as 50. So in order to do that, we are going to need to modify our code. And the first thing we are needing to modify is our move by value, because this is the amount of pixels that we are moving the element to the right. Well, since we also want to move to the left, move by is going to have to be negative, because if it is positive, we move to the right. If it's negative, we move to the left. So we need some way in order to maintain some integrity for the move by variable whenever we are moving to the right or moving to the left. And the easiest way to do that is to specify move by as a parameter. So we will specify move by there, and we can get rid of this variable. Now, if you'll remember, whenever we call setInterval, we can't execute this function. So we can't call moveBox and pass a value of 3. But we can use an anonymous function that calls moveBox. Just like this. So now whenever setInterval executes, it's going to execute this anonymous function that inside is going to execute moveBox and pass a value of 3. So this is a way that we can get around using functions that accept an argument. We can use an anonymous function to call that function, just like I've done here. So now we have our move by parameter, and we are moving the element by whatever is specified by that parameter. But we need to modify the move by value whenever we reach the boundary on the right hand side, because we need to then turn it into a negative value. So the first thing we need to do is make our boundary a little bit more robust, because we need to make sure that move by is positive. So move by is greater than 0 and left is greater than 400. So this would be the code used to determine if we are moving to the right and if we reach our boundary on the right hand side. Let's go ahead and write the code for our left hand boundary. It's going to be very similar, but we will do move by is less than 0 because we are moving to the left, and left is less than 50, or let's do 49 or 51. So these are our two boundaries. If move by is positive, then we are moving to the right, and therefore whenever we reach our boundary, then we want to clear the timeout, and then we want to change the value of move by. If we are moving to the left, then move by is going to be negative, and we want to make sure that whenever we hit the boundary that the left position is less than 51, then we want to clear the timeout and change the value of move by. So we've already cleared the timeout. All we need to do then is set a new interval, setting the value of timer, and then modifying the value of the move by parameter. So let's do timer equals set interval. And once again, we're going to use an anonymous function. And inside this function, we are going to call moveBox, move by, and we are going to multiply by -1, because multiplying by -1 reverses whatever that value is. So if it's a positive value, it's going to be a negative value, and if it's a negative value, then it's going to be a positive value. So we are calling moveBox again with the switched value, and then we need to specify the speed. And I believe that's it. We don't need to modify this. because if move by is negative, then it's going to be left plus negative 3 in this case, which is going to move left. If move by is positive, then it's going to be left plus positive 3. So that's going to be fine. So I believe we are finished. Let's go back to the browser and refresh. And we'll hit the boundary, and we'll just keep going back and forth and back and forth. So this is just one of the ways that we can do animation using JavaScript. And I say just one of the ways because we can actually do animation using different logic. Instead of keeping track of an element's position and setting up boundaries, we could base an animation on an amount of steps. So if we wanted an animation to go for 10 steps, then our code would take those steps into account. But we're not going to go into that. We are just going to be happy that we have a bouncing box going back and forth. So in the next lesson, we are going to talk about events. And events are probably one of the most important topics that we will talk about in this second half of the course, because this allows us to interact with the user based upon their actions. So I will see you next time. Have a good one.